Hello, my name is Melinda Michail, and I'm going to present to you a paper that I presented in June 2021 to NAIITS, an Indigenous Learning Community, and the University of Divinity. It was part of my Graduate Certificate of Divinity, and I was taught under Professor Mark Brett and Naomi Wolfe this subject, which was Hebrew Scriptures, Theology and History. Just a disclaimer, I'm going to be operating two devices to record this, so there may be some technical issues. I'm also going to be using PowerPoint with slides, which may be full screen or may not be full screen. I want to take this opportunity today to honour my own ancestors and the ancestors of the land that I'm going to be speaking from. So this paper is called Identity Formation, Ezra 9 to 10 in the Old Testament. I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people of the country that I was birthed on, and also the Darug and Guringai country that I was grown on, and the Dharawal country that now nourishes my children and I. I honour the ancestors of these lands and give my respects to their elders. Land is a sacred gift from the Creator with life-giving power. I also honour my Coptic, Irish, German and British ancestors and acknowledge their collective forging of my story. In this presentation, I will be seeking to interpret an ancient Hebrew text through the eye of a common Coptic woman and apply it to my community of fellow common Copts internationally. I will be using images and quotes in a very intentional way, and I invite you, the listener, to go on a journey with me that speaks of how people and land are bound together. Historical realities will be invoked by a perception of place and a construction of identity. Please note that some of the quotes I will be using are from speakers of other languages and may not use correct English grammar. Any emphasis in the quotes has been added by me. In Ezra 9 and 10 in the ancient Hebrew scriptures, we read of an accusation formed by one group against another. A claim has been made that those who returned from exile, the Gola, are special, the holy seed, and that they alone have an exclusive right to all of God's promises, especially an inheritance of land and wealth. They believed they had a responsibility to protect the purity of their identity by separating from those referred to as the peoples of the land. Ezra is located within the book of Ezra Nehemiah and contains three different events of return. We will be looking at the unfolding of the second return, Ezra chapter 7, verses 1 to 10. Ezra chapter 7, verses 1 to chapter 10, verse 44, focusing in on chapters 9 and 10. The key factors involved were the Persian king Artaxerxes, the Jewish leader Ezra, the vision to rebuild the community as the first stage of the temple reconstruction process, the central character, the people, and the opposition, the governor of Judah, Zerubbabel, and the peoples of the land. In this important and history-impacting story, we see how the leaders of the exiles shifted ethnic borders, emphasizing the entrepreneurial role in ethnic politics. They were determined to reconstruct the history of the Israelite people. The text contains an exclusive ethnic theology, which condones a colonizing story and is also gender oppressive. Ezra Nehemiah is in no way neutral and is embedded within the ideological world of its author, oppressing the voice of the marginalized group. The Gola have a colonial character, working closely with imperial power to establish themselves in the land and to present a holy self, separating from an unholy other. The Gola were children of forced migrants. This was the land of their ancestors. There is nuance. The exiles also saw themselves as a group who had compromised their own purity. The holy seed had defiled itself and had work to do. We see this in Ezra 9, verse 4, where the Gola were called Ma'al, faithless. So Ezra 9 and 10, who are we? Let's look at the identity journey. First of all, the peoples of the land, defining who we are not. The purity illusion, lateral trauma. Lateral trauma is when we attack each other sideways because we have been pushed down for so long. It's also known as lateral violence, but here I will look at lateral trauma, which is the violence that happens when a people are traumatized from being oppressed for so long. Copts, the peoples of the land, Arab invasion and Coptic tenacity. Copts as the Gola, intergenerational trauma. So this is a bit of an outline of where we're going to head. Mosaic law. Israel's responsibility to foreigners. In Ezra chapter 9, verse 12, we see in Ezra's prayer, never seek their peace or prosperity. This was something Ezra actually asked God for. But in Deuteronomy 10, verse 19, we see God's commandments. You must love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And in Exodus 23, verse 9, you shall not oppress a stranger. You know the heart of the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Voices in the text. The voices a text includes are as significant as those it ignores. Silencing of the actual voices of those who had remained in the land. Different tactics are used to secure position, even if it means to undermine everyone else but the insiders. Ezra's prayer in Ezra 9 is more political than religious. It tends to solidify the positions of the accusers and condemns the accused and their foreign wives at once. Through prayer, Ezra appeals to divine authority and involves traditional texts, staging the platform for the returnees' restoration claims. Were not merely opposed to the rebuilding of the temple, rather, they were opposed to the exclusion from the rebuilding process. The peoples of the land, defining who we are not. The Ezra text exposes its perception of place and people of our task. The Ezra text exposes its perception of place and people, and our task here is to glean any transformative elements. Significant questions to ask are, what kind of society is endorsed and promoted in the text? Has an alternative view been suppressed? How are the people that it condemns characterized? As a victim of colonial construction and cultural misrepresentation myself, I am sensitive to such characterization. The text presents two main groups: the children of the Gola, the exiles, and the peoples of the land. The Gola are place seekers wanting to negotiate a place to settle. The peoples of the land are a rooted group, the first inhabitants. Ezra 9 and 10 doesn't simply identify the latter group, but narrates with a gaze that vilifies and victimizes. Ezra 9 verse 1, verse 11, and chapter 10 verse 2 and 11 focus on how the peoples of the land threaten the Gola's social, religious, economic, and political well-being. Foreign women are also vilified and blamed in Ezra 10 verses 2 and verse 14. Ezra 9 and 10 is woven with a vision to control and dominate. Yahweh's silence, Ezra 9 to 10, completely suppresses the voices of those accused of polluting both the land and the holy race. Ironically, it also silenced the voice of the one they intend to serve, Yahweh. The major driving force is the need to possess and inherit land, though masked by a claim to moral impurity. Violence. A system that is socially purist, racist, and elitist, religiously fanaticist, Yahwist, temple-centered, Torah-led. They distorted the well-known concept of all Israel, which had serious implications for religious, social, and economic relations. That my own people are discriminating against me makes it worse than the experience of the colonized. Who are the peoples of the land? There are two viable options: non-exiled Judeans, number one, from 597 to 581 BCE, approximately 10% of the Judean population was deported by the Babylonians. This was mostly the ruling class and skilled workers. The majority of those left behind were working class, elderly, and rural residents who became landowners. When the exiles returned, there were issues with reclaiming their land. Thus, the peoples of the land term was defined as those who had remained. Or number two, non-exiled Judeans and non-Judeans. In these two groups were the remainees. Then the exiles saw them as one impure group who deserved exclusion. Colonial domination, the land. The negative attitude of the text to the land and its peoples resonates with the experiences of natives. To erect a boundary or to claim ownership of a particular place, land, is the stuff of colonization. The displacement of peoples in their own lands. The native. The colonizers' most significant ideological achievement was the invention of the native, a category embracing all non-Europeans. The native, singular and masculine, lacked European virtues such as application and foresight. His mind worked in mysterious ways. Treated as aliens in their own land and in their own community. Land is spiritual, emotional, and relational. Othering, the imperial self. The community must be clear as to the identity and difference of the other so that it can be clear as to the identity of the self. The imperial and central self cannot exist without the colonized and marginal other, who becomes what the self is not, a negation. Separatism. We have the foreign women. We have the peoples of the land. Only a minority of the people were taken away, with the tens of thousands still left. There is no suggestion that any foreign peoples were brought in to replace those deported. These peoples of the land were the Jewish descendants of those who were not deported. The fact is, people of Israelite descent are excluded from Israel. Erasure. Their arguments reinforce the identity of the community from the inside by ignoring outsiders. Such others simply do not exist. Ideology inscribed in the idea that after the fall of Jerusalem, the land observed its Sabbaths for 70 years as it lay desolate and unpopulated. The myth of the empty land is therefore the creation of the Judeo-Babylonian immigrant community, which achieved social, economic, and religious dominance in Judah during the first century of Iranian rule. This return to Zion is a defining moment in the consciousness of the Jewish people, and it was inevitable that it would be seen as model for the Zionist settlement in Palestine in modern times. An ideological strategy by the exiles to delete the Remainees from the history of Judah. They were not willing to work with the local authorities and sources of governance. Ezra invoked Deuteronomy 7, verses 1 to 6 in his prayer, and it was likely that he viewed the return from Babylon as another exodus to repossess the land by dispossessing and destroying its occupants and their religion. There is a distinct lack of respect and reciprocity given to the peoples of the land, seen in a violation of space. The Judah and the exiles had left was ruled by their own kings. The Judah that the exiles had left was ruled by their own kings. The one that they had now returned to was a small province, Yehud, of a foreign empire, Persia. If we look at a leader of the exiles and a leader of the peoples of the land, the difference in attitude is stark. In Ezra 9, verse 3, we see a strong reaction from Ezra toward the Remainees. When I heard this, I tore my clothes and cloak, pulled out hair from my head and beard, and sat down in shock. This was a public confession attracting the devout, Ezra 9, verse 4. In the following chapter, we read that an absence from this assembly resulted in community expulsion and confiscation of property. An agreement was made to separate from the peoples of the land, which included the harsh demand that the husbands who had married foreign women, be separated from their wives and children. In contrast to this, we hear a voice from the peoples of the land with Shechaniah's calming statement in Ezra 10, verse 2. Which was spoken on behalf of those who married returnees. We've been unfaithful to our God, but even now there is hope for Israel in spite of this. The phrase "our God" is a very different narrative to the dominant theology presented, that Yahweh is only the God of the exiles. Shechaniah goes on to offer advice and options, urging Ezra to make a decision and take action. His speech offers Ezra authority, wisdom, and experience. The worldview that shapes the text is that foreigners are faithless and therefore need separating from. The language used in Ezra 2 becomes gradually more exclusive, shifting from Israel to all Israel, 2 verse 70, meaning those who returned from exile to Jerusalem and Judah, that's who it meant. All Israel started to just mean those who returned. In spite of this assertion, however, the reality is that most of the returnees had never lived in the land. The peoples of the land, however, had lived in their hometowns for at least a couple of generations after the collapse of Judah in 587 BCE. They had never left. The rejection of the peoples of the land set the tone for the rest of the reconstruction of the temple. This strong native community naturally reacted to their exclusion and engaged in social action to express their disapproval. We see the different strategies they used in Ezra 4, verses 4 to 6, and verse 24. Part of why they were excluded was because they opposed the empire, as well as the group who worked with the empire, Ezra 1 to 6. This separatism led to socio-ideological division, which completely delegitimized the Judean community that had remained in the land. A survival strategy. The problem with the returnees is they are looking for a place that exists only in their memory and imagination. A survival strategy that reflects the memory of communal trauma, initially shaped in Babylon and subsequently transformed on Judean soil. Ezra is characterized as imposing a tradition that has long exceeded its relevance into a context so different from that into which the Exodus generation entered. It aims for a religious, cultural, political, as well as genealogical continuity with the previous monarchic period. Nostalgia for past, symbols, myths of origin, and ethnic election are some of the instruments used by the elites. Communal trauma and identity. Chosen trauma. When a chosen trauma becomes the focus of identity, the originating trauma becomes a prism through which new experiences are evaluated, often provoking intense negative emotions, a tendency to magnify social differences, and extreme measures designed to avoid any further harm. Recovery from trauma is a challenge to find a narrative continuity between the past, present, and future, a narrative repair. And in the case of communal trauma, this process can take generations. This is an identity process. Self-esteem. Identity is shaped over decades and even centuries in relation to an originating trauma suffered at the hands of another group. But instead of raising a group's self-esteem, the mental image of the event links people through a continuing sense of powerlessness, as though members of the group existed under a large tent of victimhood. Opposition to mixed marriage reflects signs of trauma. I think that's an interesting point. There is definitely an opposition to mixed marriage in my own community amongst Copts. The purity illusion, lateral trauma. In Ezra 9 and 10, we see clear xenophobic attitude from the Gola to the peoples of the land who are blamed for polluting the land. Exclusivity, social conflict. If an identity formation process is exclusive, it results in social conflict. And if it is inclusive, it results in community solidarity. To enhance their self-esteem, they start to compare their group with other groups. They evaluate their group positively and other groups negatively. Ethnic entitlement. Exclusivist identity groups are likely to defend their discriminatory tendencies by claiming to protect some purity and originality, while reality proves that no social group remains pure and original for its entire history. The contest for group legitimacy, for political inclusion and exclusion, merges with the quest for group worth to form a politics of ethnic entitlement. The overt message is, don't mingle with them and don't give them a place in the land. Mixing the two groups is seen as an offense against Yahweh. In order to keep their relationship with Yahweh, they disregard it with others. Language is used here as a tool to degrade. The Remainees are seen as outsiders, abominable, impure, unclean, and untouchable. Ezra 9 verses 1 and 11 and 14. The phrase and the words chosen to describe the Remainees are gendered as feminine, whilst the exiles refer to themselves in the masculine. In Ezra 9 and 10, it's therefore not surprising that women were targeted as the feminine other. These women were labeled as foreign, which implies that they were outsiders. In other Hebrew texts, foreign women were seen as the reason for the fall of Judah. Their influence was feared, and Ezra's demand to expel them was very radical and also impractical. They were seen as alien, immoral, strange, forbidden, seductresses, and disregarders of the covenant. They must be avoided because they lie in wait for prey and destroy the faithful. The word foreign also implies the worship of other deities. In Ezra, interaction with foreigners literally became a sin. Such intentional alienation is cruel, and there's little evidence that Persia instigated this kind of segregation elsewhere. Even Haggai and Zechariah, the prophets quoted in Ezra and Nehemiah, display no such hostility toward the peoples of the land. The text equates faithfulness with ethnic purity. However, preserving ethnic purity is an illusion because some of their own honored ancestors married foreign women. For example, King David and his sister Abigail, Joseph, Judah, and Moses. In all of this irony, the irony is that these women may well have been Jewish women who weren't seen as ritually pure. The purity laws were actually used to create new religious and ethnic boundaries, attacking people who were their own. Lateral violence, as I mentioned before, is a common response to trauma. After being distressed for a long time, you begin to attack your own brothers and sisters. The leaders, the common people and their wives who complained about their desperate economic condition, Nehemiah 5 verses 1 to 5. The Jews whose children couldn't speak Hebrew, chapter 13, verses 23 to 24. They remind the reader that the majority of Jewish people in the province at that time had very different ideas from those of Ezra and Nehemiah about what was or was not essentially implied in being Jewish. The restoration program of the temple is perceived as an attempt to re-establish their space with Yahweh in a new way. To maintain their purity, they have to separate themselves from other peoples as impure, irrespective of who they are and what they do. Purity language was used to delineate Israel. Israel was seen as a remnant, a holy seed, and it had to delineate between Israel and exile. Identity markers were established: ethnicity, genealogy, and holiness. The temple, hard hearts. This factor even complicates and reinforces an identity crisis, for when scarce resources are linked to identity, the motive to exclude hardens the heart. Expulsion from their assembly had serious economic consequences for those expelled, Ezra 10, verse 8. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. That's a Martin Luther King comment. Quote, the spirituality of the exiles leaves much to be desired. Economics. Now I'd like to have a look at the Copts as peoples of the land and look at Arab invasion and Coptic tenacity. I will explore my own experiences and analogies as a Coptic woman in 2021. Violence demands conformity and total obedience. Imagine becoming a foreigner from birth, a stranger in the land of your own ancestors. The Copts are the ancient and original people of Egypt. Their bloodline goes back to the pharaohs. I should actually specify our bloodline. Coptic worshippers are sometimes killed while simply standing in front of their church. They have endured over 1,300 years of Arab invasion, which inevitably includes Arabization and Islamization. Understandably, Copts often avoid any involvement in political or public affairs that don't affect them. Non-citizens, Dhimma. Dhimma is a term for protected non-Muslim people who choose to continue to live within the context of the abode of Islam and agree to have special duties. They are not seen as equal to Muslims. They are not seen as true citizens, and they must pay extra tax. They can't have any government jobs or prominent positions over Muslims or participate in the Islamic army. This was the status given to all Copts in Egypt. It officially ended in 1856, but it's still active unofficially, especially with the rise of radical Islam. Copts are not permitted to build, renovate, or repair their churches. We Copts are not from the center of empire, Ezra 4 verse 2. We are not supported by the king, Ezra 4 verse 3. We are not allowed to participate, Ezra 6 verses 21 to 22. We are not accepted into the community, Nehemiah 13 verses 1 to 3. Building new mosques is almost unconditionally approved by Egyptian law. Since 1934, the government created a list of 10 arbitrary conditions that restricted the building and renovating of churches in Egypt. In the South, an application to build a church has taken 28 years in a village with no churches and a population of more than 3,000 Christians. Funerals and weddings take place in the middle of the street. Continuity, entirety, and annexation. The people. Utilizing strategies of division and drawing distinctions between one's own group and other groups, all speakers base the exclusive status of their communities on three arguments: continuity, entirety, and the annexation of historical national traditions. In different ways, they make the argument that we and no other group are the people, the entire people, and that we, only we, inherit and embody the shared traditions of our communal past. Arguments of exclusivity are marshaled to construct both sides of the process of group identity formation, shaping both the self-legitimizing claims of the in-group and the delegitimizing arguments directed against those designated as the out-group. Centering. The exiles defined their categories of otherness solely over against what had happened, was happening in Judah Yehud, a central ideological tendency. In the Babylonian diaspora, Deuteronomic theology influenced their worldview and solidified the polemic against Judean natives. They had formed new rituals and prioritized some older ones. Isolation and passivity. The church also became occupied with flattening the political authorities. This is the Coptic Orthodox Church in Egypt, proclaiming loyalty to the militant government and preserving the minimal rights of Christians. Therefore, isolation and passivity became the main features of the Christian minority. The fears of isolation increased as the rise of political Islam represented in the Muslim Brotherhood that seeks to Islamize the whole Egyptian society and threatens the Christian existence in Egypt. The dominant attitude among Egyptian Copts is that they identify with Sarah in the story of Sarah and Hagar, even though they are direct descendants of Hagar, who was Egyptian. This is an Old Testament story found in the Hebrew Scriptures. Egyptian Muslims believe Hagar and Ishmael are their ancestors. Egyptian Christians suffer at the hands of Muslims, but still refuse to acknowledge Hagar, who suffered at the hands of Sarah. Copts became interested in their early history during the mid-1800s when they gained theoretical citizenship within the Egyptian nation state. The Coptic Museum in Cairo opened in 1910, and it was the first time that we as Copts could witness aspects of our ancient history. Two questions are important to be considered here. One, how did Copts construct their ethno-religious identity during that time? And two, what strategies did they develop to be part of the nation state between 1868 and 1918? Icladius Labib, a Copt and leading Coptologist, initiated the first movement to revive Coptic as a spoken language. Coptic was the main language of Egypt at the time of the Arab conquest in the 7th century, but Arabization and Islamization sought to destroy it. sought to wipe out the Coptic language. At the end of this period, the societal frame of reference shifted to Coptic advantage. Egyptian society experienced huge changes that allowed the Coptic community to open schools, create printed media, and recover its own history and heritage. I'll be using the term of they, the Copts, and we, the Copts, intermittently. Part of an intentional strategy to destroy the Coptic language and wipe it out was the cutting off of our tongues for speaking our own language, Coptic, by Arabs. During this period of revival, however, there was a reconnection with writings of the early fathers that were grounded in their own deep spiritual experiences, which formed experiential theology, which is still an influence in the Coptic Church today. Hope, rather than focusing on Coptic ancestry, it encourages a new generation of members to find God themselves within the church and its heritage. The most obvious mark of Coptic identity is a small tattooed cross on the inside wrist or next to the right thumb on the right hand. So here or here. This is a declaration of Christian faith, as well as an expression of resistance to Islamic authority, and has nourished Coptic tenacity for countless generations. The reason why I don't yet have that tattoo there is because I have struggled with my own identification as being Orthodox and part of the Orthodox faith. Predictably, the Copts have been portrayed as an uncivilized peoples who lived at the margins of the empire, needing imperial colonization for their own good. Intergenerational trauma continues to have a significant impact on Coptic identity. Self-blame and self-rejection is typical for survivors of trauma. Social and socio-psychological behavior patterns can be seen in the Coptic community as mechanisms of survival. Who are we, ancient peoples of the land? Who are the true Egyptians? Ecladius Labib answered that a true Egyptian is someone who speaks the language of his ancestors, the pharaohs, believes in the religion of the pharaohs, performs the customs of his ancestors, is devoted to learning the language, religion, and customs, both past and present, of his ancestors, and does not lose his own language, religion, customs, and patriotism, even after experiencing atrocities and persecution by foreign invaders such as the Persians, Greeks, Romans, and Arabs. The true church. Christians in Egypt have been suffering from personal and collective discrimination. A common discourse that emphasizes the Christian indifference about injustice and oppression, as long as that injustice does not affect our obedience to God. That discourse portrays Christians as strangers and foreigners in their country. Our indifference and isolation put our understanding of God's justice and sovereignty at stake. I would now like to look at Copts as the goaler, as persecutors, intergenerational trauma, and link that to a survival strategy from trauma. Ezra chapter 9 and 10 ignores the voices of the peoples of the land, foreign women, their husbands, and their children. No chance was given to defend themselves. When you grow up within a marginalized culture, you're taught by the dominant group to despise your own traditions and to favor theirs. Self-rejection. Hagar does not belong to us. She is the great-grandmother of Muslims. Hagar does belong to us. She is our ancestor, and we claim her. Egyptian Christians denounce Hagar because she is elevated by their Muslim opponents. Like Sarah, the Egyptian Christian woman sometimes rejects her sister, who is different in religion or social and economic class. Sarah believed that her abuse of Hagar was justified by God. In 1952, there were political changes in Egypt with a military coup. The government banned political parties, confiscated the properties of many wealthy Christians and Muslims, and arrested and killed many opponents. Copts withdrew from the political arena and have been isolating, seeking protection inside the church walls ever since. A complex resistance, submission. For a long time, our church in Egypt has kept teaching on the submission of women to men, of Christians to the state, of laypersons to church leaders, etc. The church considers submission as the only acceptable Christian behavior. The God who helped Hagar to survive on her own, a God of resistance, human dignity, and new beginnings, the God who helped Hagar. What happens with chosen trauma is that a group selects particular memories from a range of options and places them at the center of their group identity. In spite of the Ezra Nehemiah text being most likely written in Yehud, there is a group of scholars who consider it might have been written in Babylon. It was definitely written by people who developed an insular protective approach to survival in Babylon. However, there is the possibility that it was written in Babylon. But interestingly enough, it rarely gives attention to the proximate others, the groups comprising Babylonian society, with whom the exiles now had to establish social relationships. They became insular and began to center themselves as a trauma response. This is what I propose has happened to my people, the Copts. Here is a group of Coptic monks. The socio-anthropological phenomenon that nations or groups within a nation tend to redefine their collective identity on specific occasions, particularly under threat or distress. Survival. We must survive. One of the foibles of the advocacy of Christian minority in Egypt is its lack of inclusiveness. As a result of the long history of isolation, the church in Egypt adopted a different set of jargon or terminology. Many of the church leaders refused to use any shared background with the Muslim majority. Coptic identity has become a strictly ethno-religious one, even though this is not the case. It is a way the Copts have chosen to define themselves. The non-Coptic Orthodox world is now seen as other, less than, and impure. It must be avoided and kept separate. Protestant and Catholic traditions of the Christian faith are not valued as equally legitimate. Sadly, this includes a consistent rejection of our own Copts who do not identify as Coptic Orthodox. Purity becomes used as legitimacy, becomes equated with legitimacy. Purity language. If we look at Ezra 9 verse 2, we have Israel, the holy seed. Ezra 9 verse 8, in Yahweh's holy place. Ezra 9 verse 11, the land is unclean because of the peoples of the land and their impure abominations. They're seen as liars and rebels. Divorce them. There was definitely a diminishing in this approach. Their exclusivity retarded the rebuilding of the temple in two main aspects: duration and splendor. The temple was not as big as the previous temple had been, or elaborate and illustrious. Haggai 2 verse 3 proves that the exclusive theology and ideology of Ezra Nehemiah is a retrogressive approach that retards reconstruction. It becomes clear why it was so difficult for the exiles to keep the promises they made to Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah were demolishing community solidarity that a recovering community like the Yehud community needed so desperately. Their exclusive ethnic theology, ideology retarded their reconstruction of the community. Put simply, the Second Temple wasn't as amazing because of the rejection by the exiles of the peoples of the land and their desire and offer to help. Purity. By selective inclusion and exclusion, history can be manipulated and controlled. Selective inclusion and exclusion can certainly be seen throughout history. The political dimension of archaeology was very evident in Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. The nationalist movements of the 19th century, which include Zionism, conscripted the archaeologist in the project of recovering and, where necessary, inventing a national history. The PEF, Palestinian Exploration Fund, under the patronage of Queen Victoria, is another good example. The Archbishop of York made it very clear that Christians, especially British Christians, had a sovereign right to the exploration of the Holy Land. We mean to walk through Palestine in the length and breadth of it, because that land has been given to us. It is the land from which comes the news of our redemption. It is the land to which we look with as true a patriotism as we do to this dear old England. This is a prime example of religiously sponsored colonialism. I am highlighting in these analogies the similarities between British and American colonialism and Arab domination of Copts. However, as I have previously outlined, I'm also looking at how those invaders use superiority, exclusivity, as a means to control, and how the resulting trauma of that can begin to form a deeply entrenched survival strategy of exclusivity, purity in our identity. This is how I believe my people became a self-identifying ethno-religious group, in spite of being much more than this. Invaders see those they invade as devoid of all civil inhabitants. They see the land that way. Similar to the British colonial attitude towards Palestinians, we learn of early Puritan settlers in America in the 1630s, who declared that the land was devoid of all civil inhabitants. At this point in our discussion, in spite of all that seeks to erase us as Copts, it is absolutely critical to acknowledge that there is a consistent rising of the displaced. We see this with Palestinians as well. They'll never actually be controlled or silenced. We will never be silenced. I'd like to look at the example of Mary Assad, a woman I greatly admire and who is now my ancestor. She was a Coptic activist who lived from 1922 to 2018. She fought very hard to end female genital mutilation in Egypt, our country, and on the behalf of the Zabaleen. She was a Coptic activist who would never be silenced. I follow in her footsteps as a Coptic activist who will not be silenced. She volunteered for more than 20 years with the Al-Zabaleen community of Copts who are garbage collectors in Muqattam, a hilly district overlooking Cairo. She helped the garbage collectors by providing education and enabling innovative projects. As a result, the community recycled 85% of the collected garbage. She developed a 4-factor approach to improve the conditions of the Zabaleen by focusing on healthcare, capacity building, education, and relations among different people. Mary also succeeded in making female genital mutilation illegal in Egypt. Our challenge here has been to recover repressed and unheard voices in the ancient text of Ezra and Nehemiah in order to expose the rhetoric of domination and link this to my own people's identity journey, the Copts of Egypt. We are not just an ethno-religious group. We are much more than that. And our self-identity has been a survival strategy because of trauma. All throughout history, colonizers have dehumanized the peoples of the land to justify land theft. Questions of self-identity and definition, self-definition, and the exclusion and inclusion of other groups are part of the process of every community's identity formation. We are not victims, however we have seen ourselves, however we present ourselves to the world as Copts, and however Arabs have seen us and the world perceives us. We are not victims. We cannot allow the ideologies of colonialism and invasion to become the story of our existence, as it is a discourse that continues to center colonial relations of power and privilege that hinders our ability to move forward by consciously reinforcing victimizing constructs of reality. That is the end of my presentation. I sincerely thank you for listening.